Hi, I'm Rahul Chandwani, and let's get started with this chapter. So, I just want to go through some of the basic tools that I use for modeling my environments in Blender. So, for those of you who are new, I'm just going to go through just some of the basic shortcuts, basic tools, and maybe some few tricks that I use to model environments. So, let's get started. Just for your basic controls, if you are coming from maybe some other software, Maya or Max, you might be used to using a gizmo for your movements. But I highly recommend getting used to the hotkeys for your movements. So G is to move. Most of your movement is done through obviously your axis. So G plus Z is to move along the Z axis, and similarly for X and Y. But you can also choose to move by excluding a certain axis. So for example, if I only want to move my object on the Y and X axis, I can exclude the Z axis by pressing Shift Z. So now my model only moves along the X-axis and the Y-axis, not on the Z-axis. So this is good if I want to kind of move my models along this plane, but I don't want it to move upwards. This is something that I use a lot. And the same goes for the X-axis and the Y-axis as well. So if I exclude the X-axis, this would just move in the Z and the Y-axis, and similarly for the Y-axis as well. So this is just your basic movements. Obviously, X is to delete your object. Shift A is where you can append all your cylinders, cubes, everything basically that you need for modeling. So for environments, most of my modeling is pretty simple. Most of my modeling includes just extruding and insetting. So that's pretty much most of my modeling, and adding edge loops, and then extruding, insetting. So extruding is E. You can extrude a plane or a surface by E, and insetting is I. So let's just model something basic like a pillar. And you add edge loops by Control R, and how many times you scroll determines how many edge loops you get. So let's say I want to add more edge loops, and select this loop. And so what happens here is, if you want to try and extrude this whole loop of faces, Blender doesn't know in which direction it goes for it to go, so it'll just kind of extrude it in some random direction. So what you can do here is press Alt E and extrude faces along normals. So now it'll kind of extrude all the faces along its respective normals. So you can kind of, this is good for extruding kind of this way. So insetting, I'll just kind of inset. So if you press inset once, it'll kind of inset all of your faces that you've selected. But if you press inset again, it'll kind of inset each face individually. Let me just reset the scale. So you can do stuff like that, add kind of more edge loops if you want to. Uh, and the next is bevel. You bevel by pressing Control B, and the more you scroll, the more loops you would add. So you could use this to soften your models up. One cool thing about bevels is, if you kind of bevel and go into this drop down menu here, you can go into custom and kind of play around with this curve over here, and you can kind of get these random shapes. And if you increase the segments here, you can get this kind of random detail. So I think this is really cool if you want to add a kind of random detail to your model, especially for pillars like this. So if you model again, it will remember the shapes that you made. So I find this really cool. Also, if you want to kind of create steps really quickly, you can kind of go into the preset here and click steps. This is kind of like a quick way for you to add steps. In Blender, if you want to duplicate your objects, you press Shift D. But what happens with Shift D is, it's actually duplicating your object and adding more vertices to your scene. So if you see here, you have 234 vertices in your scene right now, and if I duplicate this, it increases to 430. So if you want to avoid kind of slowing down your scene and increasing the amount of vertices, I recommend instancing your object. So when you instance an object, it just creates it doesn't duplicate the object, it just creates a copy. So this object here is now kind of a copy. So you instance by pressing Alt D. And so basically all these two images are a copy of this sorry, these two models are a copy of this model here. So whatever I do to this model will happen to these other models because these are copies. So I recommend if you want to duplicate the same model, especially if it's a high poly model over and over again, I recommend instancing instead of duplicating. If you want to mirror your objects, you can add a modifier from your modifiers tab. So this is where you add modifiers. You could add modifiers for adding subdivisions, bevels, wireframes. We'll talk more about this a bit later, but if you can add a mirror modifier if you need to mirror your objects, so you can select on which axis you want to mirror them. So but I generally just use hard ops. So because I have hard ops installed, if I press Alt X and it'll bring me this gizmo kind of thing, and I can choose where I want to mirror my models. I just find this a lot more handy compared to kind of having to go into my modifier stack over and over again. Also in Blender, if you want to repeat a certain action, you can press Shift R. So let's say I instance this whole thing and I want to repeat the action over and over again. I can just press Shift R and you can repeat the same action over and over again. Let's talk about how I model pipes and stuff like that. I want to show you kind of a technique that I use to model pipes, handles, kind of railings, etc. So one thing about Blender is that so let's say you had a cube and you wanted to bevel this part, it'll kind of create kind of an average between this edge here and this edge here and bevel in between. But if you just want to bevel one vertex, you can press Ctrl Shift B and it'll just bevel one vertex. So I use this method to kind of create pipes. So I'll delete only my faces here. So if you go in X, you can choose to only delete the faces. So now you have your edges. And what I'll do is I'll just extrude my vertices here and kind of bevel all of these vertices here. And what I'll do is I'll go to Object, Convert, Curve, and if I go down here into Geometry and increase the depth, I start to get kind of this pipe shape. So I'll use this method a lot to create pipes, railings, handles, etc. And you can always edit your pipes here, but usually if I want to edit this, I'll kind of just go back into my mesh and then just make whatever changes I want to make. I've added my curve to my quick favorites, so I'll just create it into a curve again, increase the depth, and now I have a pipe in the new shape that I wanted. And if I want to apply all the changes that I made to this and turn this back into a mesh, I'll press Ctrl A and visual geometry to mesh. So whenever you have an object with a lot of modifiers and you want to kind of just apply all those modifiers together, you can press visual geometry to mesh and it'll apply all the modifiers to your mesh. So now this object isn't a curve anymore. It's an actual mesh with faces. So usually I'll just go in and add whatever details I need that pipes usually have. I'll also use this to model handlebars. I'll delete the faces here, delete the edge. And then I'll convert this to curve. And I'll just kind of add I'll use this method to create handlebars quite a bit. Oh, sorry, railings quite a bit. Let's I want to show you some cool things that I do with hard ops. So let's just add a few more subdivisions to these. So if I would need to kind of array this in a circular fashion, kind of I want to have this handlebar go around this. Radial array doesn't always work. It usually does this kind of blocky thing. So for this, I'll use this option here, twist 360. So this way I can kind of scroll up and down and add less or more. So now I have kind of a circular railing over here. And if I duplicate this and go back into twist 360, I kind of have this circular pathway. So I use this a lot. Another thing is I'll use the array here. I think I showed this in the last chapter. But one thing I want to talk about is proportional editing. So if you go to this circle here, if you switch it on, you can you have this radius you can see around your selection that you can increase and decrease using your scroll wheel. So this just means that it has this kind of a soft selection around whatever you selected. So compared if I had this turned off, it would just kind of move whatever vertices I have selected. But with proportional editing, it kind of has this soft selection. So if I were or ever want to create damaged railings, I'll just usually go in. So another thing in Blender is if you want to rotate something, you press R. But if I want to rotate something along its own axis, along its own center, you press R twice. And now you can kind of rotate something along the center of whatever you have selected. So I'll usually use proportional editing to kind of create damaged railings and stuff like that, or just bend stuff that's kind of metal or destroyed. Also, another cool thing is if you go into your editor mode and have any part of your object selected, if you press Shift W, for this one you need to have your 3D cursor kind of at the point of your selection. So if you press Shift W, you have this kind of radius to kind of play around with to kind of curve and bend your objects. As long as you have enough polygons or vertices in your object, you can bend and do stuff like this to your object. So this is also another cool way you can kind of add, I guess, more damage or whatever. Like if this railing was destroyed, or if a car crashed into this part and kind of destroyed this part of the railing. So I use this a lot. If I ever want to create railings quickly for models that are kind of far away in my scene, I'll usually just use a wireframe modifier. So basically what a wireframe modifier does is it turns whatever object you have into kind of just it turns a wireframe into a mesh. So let's go into wireframe. So I have my cube with these with this wireframe, and what the add-on does is it kind of just gives you the ability to create a mesh out of your wireframe. So what I'll do if I want to create railings that are circular, but I don't need them to be really detailed because they're far away, I'll just kind of I'll use a cylinder and kind of delete the top and bottom faces and kind of turn this into a wireframe modifier. So I could use this for something that's far away. And it looks good because you're not really seeing details. Another modifier I use a lot is the subdivision modifier. So the shortcut to add kind of a subdivision modifier is control 1. A subdivision modifier basically just adds more subdivisions to your model without in a non-destructive way. So basically your actual object doesn't have these subdivisions. They're just kind of applied on top through the modifier. So if you press control 1, you'll get like your subdivision modifier here. And you can press control 2 or 3 to kind of add more subdivision. So I'll use this to kind of add more subdivisions to my objects, but particularly I'll use this if I ever need to do some kind of organic modeling where I need to kind of combine hard and soft edges together, which is kind of hard to do when you're polymodeling. So I'll kind of reverse engineer all my shapes. So let's say I want to have all of these be kind of soft shapes, but kind of have a hard edge here. I'll add kind of a subdivision modifier and then go into edit mode and kind of reverse engineer all my hard edges back by adding edge loops. I'll just kind of add edge loops wherever I want there to be a hard edge. And so if I shade smooth now, I kind of have this object with all these hard edges and this soft edge here, which I feel is something difficult to do when you're just polymodeling. It's hard to get these shapes where you have kind of a blend between hard and soft edges. So using a subdivision modifier is kind of a cool way to achieve this effect. The last thing I want to show you guys is how I model or how I kind of create wires. So if you've seen any of my images, you'll notice that I like adding a lot of wires. I think they're a great way to add lines into your image and they're kind of a great composition tool. So I think a great way to add wires in your scene is to kind of just draw them in using curves. So you'll need kind of a surface for this one. And I'll append a Bezier curve. So this is what a Bezier curve is. And I'll delete my vertices. And here I'll go into my draw tool. And if you come here, tool tab, you can click surface and absolute offset. You can see absolute offset here. And now if you go into your orthographic view, you can basically draw in any wires. And I use this a lot when I want to create wires for my scenes. And now because this is a curve, you can go in and add depth into your wires. So feel free to be more creative with this. This is just a simple example, but if you've seen any of my images and if you see wires, this is exactly the method I use to create wires. And you can always kind of go back and edit these and kind of just have them do whatever you want. You can also go back into edit mode and just draw more if you want, now that you've already set this up. These are just some few, I think these are all the basic techniques that I use when I'm modeling. I don't think modeling for environments is really that complicated. It's just basic tools, basic technique, extruding, insetting, bevels, edge loops, your arrays, and that's pretty much it. I think for modeling with environments, mostly it has to do with what your knowledge of your skills, knowledge of your fundamentals, sorry, and it has to do with what you're modeling rather than how you're modeling. And the modeling tools themselves, I think, are pretty simple. So this isn't really a step-by-step, complete basic tutorial for everything modeling in Blender, but I just thought I'll show you guys some of the basics of the techniques that I use. That's it for this chapter. I'll see you in the next one.